Greetings, and welcome back to a Safo Academic. I got another debunk video on Thomas Sowell. I'm just gonna keep going in until I am satisfied. But the real reason I'm getting at Thomas Sowell because he's the root of all this anti-blackness that comes from black conservatives. He's the root of all this faulty thinking from the white conservatives. He is their go-to guy when they want to shit on black people and express their racism against black people via Thomas Sowell through his talking points in terms of colonization was good, black people, they didn't go through any real oppression, so they just need to get educated so they could get jobs and make money, so on and so forth. He is the godfather of a lot of these talking points running around in the echo chamber of the right wing conservative Republican Party. So, I can go at the current black conservatives like I have been doing. I've done video on Tucker Carlson, on Douglas Murray, and others as well too. But really, at the core of the anti-blackness comes from Thomas Sowell. So, in order for me to really deal with the problem, I have to revert my attention from the low-hanging fruit of Thomas Sowell and go to the root instead. So, with that being said, we have this video on colonization, and I'm going to debunk the notion that colonization was ever good for Africa. And let's get it.
Yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential, one of the greatest philosophers of our time. Yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential African Americans in Ebony magazine.
Well, he's not going to be in any list because he's a grifter. The only list he could really be on is a conservative Republican list, maybe one of the greatest black Republicans or black conservatives of all time. For sure, he can get that. But in terms of outside of that, it's a big no.
To help more people learn about him, please consider liking this video and subscribing.
And it's only going to be white people that's going to be helping other people learn about him. I see reaction videos from black people, but they barely have a full understanding of history themselves, past American history.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous part.
So he's talking about Africa, India. I'm guessing he's talking about Spanish conquest as well too. So these are the countries he's talking about. He's saying they benefited from imperialism. They benefited from another country coming in, messing with the leaders to take control of the resources and the land.
Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
Okay, so I want to give one example of a place that hasn't been touched by imperialism, right? So Indian authorities have been trying to figure out a way to recover Cho's body after he was deleted last week by islanders who apparently irked him with arrows, then buried his body on the beach. They got their drill on. Even officials don't travel to North Sentinel, where people live as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. So, because this island does not have modern roads, does not have computers, does not have currency, does not have technology, because these people are sovereign, because these people control the land, control the resources, control their military, they have a fly zone, no tolerance policy for any outsiders. To Thomas Sowell, this is a underdeveloped country because imperialism didn't come in and modernize it. That's essentially what he's saying. So I ask you, what's more important, modernization or sovereignty? Is modernization worth it to give up all your land and resources to have clothes made in China, to have computers and all these things, but to be poor at the same time too? Because when we look at the countries touched by imperialism, colonialization, most of the people are still poor despite these supposed benefits. So, is it worth it for these islanders to live modernly and to catch up with the rest of the world, to have an American currency or some type of currency connected to the world market? Is all that worth it to give up the sovereignty and the control of their own land, resources, culture, military? I'm asking you, is it worth it to give up sovereignty to be modern? Ask that question because I'm not even going to answer that question. I'm just going to continue on. Just think about that.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when
So instead of colonialism and imperialism causing mass poverty, he says the reverse happens, and we're going to hear how his reverse
the
happens.
Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland.
So, in order to justify colonialization in Africa, he's using an example of colonialization in Europe. So I'm going to repeat that again because I know it sounds like, to me, it sounds ridiculous because I'm actually educated in Black history. So he is using a example of colonialization in Europe to justify the colonialization in Africa, right? And the reason why he's doing this is because that's what Republicans, conservatives do. In order to make logic of an issue, they have to simplify the issue and reduce it. So Thomas Sowell says slavery was the same throughout history. So obviously, colonization was the same throughout history. So once you do that, once you say that slavery was the same throughout history, that means you could go in and say that reparations is not necessary and completely ignore all the nuance that goes into American slavery. Same thing with colonization. If it's all the same, hey, if it benefited Europeans, if European colonization benefited Europeans, that means European colonization could definitely benefit Africans. But he doesn't use an example in this video of colonization in Africa. He's using an example of European colonization. Now, isn't this not cherry picking to build a certain narrative? See, I'm demonstrating him using truthful factual historical information to build a narrative that's not 100% correct. It's a simple version that erases all nuance, erases serious discussion and talk. Notice, I haven't seen Thomas Sowell debate anybody. He's just usually sitting in front of a conservative shill, just ready to eat up every word that he says. But I'll continue on for the sake of continuing.
And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development.
Because Rome invaded Britain and didn't invade Scotland, Britain was ahead of Scotland.
England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. You know, 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome, but that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came, and Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland, and then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
So notice how none of this has anything to do with Africa. Just let that sink in. Okay.
Does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think...
So he asked him, so if imperialism is good, why not have more imperialism? His answer was no. So I'm going to let him answer, but we can see here that it's obvious he does not believe in all of this. It's obvious that it's all a grift. So imperialism was good, but it's not good enough to continue on. But he will give his reason, so I'll let him continue.
Politically, it's impossible. I hear from various parts it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some independent nations. They say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that.
So the imperialist nations do not want to take on the cost of taking over other countries. Now it's not economically feasible, is what he's saying, but it's a benefit, or it was a benefit to other countries. So you see the cherry picking, you see moving of the goalposts. Imperialism was good. Okay, so if imperialism is good, why don't we continue it? But it's economically not feasible. Listen to this. Like, if you do self-study, academic study, whatever study, serious study into history, you can tell that this is BS.
In the operation of the multinational corporation today, do you see that the operation of the multinational corporation as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before.
So skills that don't exist in industries that were never there before. This is the same lines of the imperialism colonization. So I ask again, we go back to this example of the islanders who deleted somebody for visiting. Is modernization worth it to give up your sovereignty of land, culture, freedom?
To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
Now, this excerpt is taken from the book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent geographic advantages that Western Europe has had over Eastern Europe, For example, more navigable waterways leading to the open seas, with Western European rivers and harbors not being frozen over, as often or as long in winter as rivers and harbors in Eastern Europe, due to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream on Western Europe. Another major historic advantage growing out of geography is that Western Europe was more readily accessible to invasion by Roman conquerors. Despite the ruthless slaughters in those conquests and the subsequent brutal oppressions by the Roman overlords, among the lasting advantages which the Roman conquests brought to Western Europe were Roman letters, so that Western European languages had written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe did. To the enormous advantages of literacy, as such, Western Europeans had the further advantage of a far greater accumulation of written knowledge in their languages.
So you see, I'm gonna let it play, but you see he's using more examples in Europe to justify colonization in Africa. These are the examples for the justification of colonization. He's not saying Africa specifically, but in essence, if he's saying colonization is good, and we know that Africa has been heavily targeted for centuries with colonization, essentially what he's saying, colonization for Africa is good. And look at the examples being used in this video.
Even after the languages of Eastern Europe began to develop written versions, but still had not yet caught up with the centuries-long accumulations of knowledge written in Western European languages. Literacy was not the only thing that moved from west to east in Europe. So did coins, printing presses, castles, crossbows, paved streets, and vaccinations, among other economic and social advances. But all of this took time, sometimes centuries. Moreover, people from Western Europe, Germans, Jews and others, were often a majority of the population in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the transition, at that point, was to Latin. Only decades later did Poles become a majority of the population in Krakow. The towns of medieval East Central Europe were often cultural enclaves of foreigners, again, mostly Germans, but with many Jews as well and, in the Balkans, Greeks and Armenians, joined in later centuries by Turks.
Okay, that's all I'm gonna play because all it is talking about Europeans and colonization there and migration and all this stuff, which has nothing to do with Africa. Okay, so what am I gonna do here is I'm gonna introduce this book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, made in 1973. Okay. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a 1972 book written by Walter Rodney that describes how Africa was deliberately exploited and underdeveloped by European colonial regimes. This one book, listen very carefully, this one book debunks everything Thomas Sowell just said in terms of Africa. I really don't care about Europe and how it was developed. It was not the same case with Africa. See, that's the problem. In order to properly understand the historical context of pre-colonial history, enslavement, post-colonial history, neocolonialism, you have to look at it at the lens of land and resources and human labor, of course, as well too. And who benefited or who profited off the land, resources, and human labor? There's only one answer. So, in terms of colonization, this one book debunks the entire premise of Thomas Sowell. He's done. He's done. This book will make you Thomas Sowell proof in terms of colonialization. Any silly argument coming from the Republicans about colonization being good, this book will save your brain from being indoctrinated. Continuing on, One of his main arguments throughout the book is that Africa developed Europe at the same rate that Europe underdeveloped Africa. It was an unfair exchange. Let's go through a little bit of the book right here. I have in PDF form. We're just going to go through the chapters. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. So chapter 1, some questions on development. 1.1, what is development? 1.2, what is underdevelopment? Very clear and concise. Chapter 2, how Africa develops before the coming of the Europeans up to the 15th century. Let me repeat that again, nice and clear. How Africa developed before the coming of the Europeans up to the 1400s. If you know about centuries, the 15th century means it was the 1400s. So, Africa developed all the way up to the 1400s. Chapter 2, general overview, and then concrete examples. Chapter 3, Africa's contribution to European capitalist development, the pre-colonial period. How Europe became the dominant section of a worldwide trade system. That's 3.1. 3.2, Africa's contribution to the economy and beliefs of early capitalist Europe. Chapter 4, Europe and the Roots of African Underdevelopment to 1885. 1400s to 1885. So this underdevelopment was going on during enslavement and continuing on. It did not stop. 4.1, the European enslavement trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. 4.2, technological stagnation and distortion of the African economy in the pre-colonial epoch. 4.3, continuing political military developments in Africa, 1500 to 1885. Chapter 5, Africa's contribution to the capitalist development of Europe, the colonial period. 5.1, exploration of African surplus under colonialism. No, sorry, expatriation of African surplus under colonialism. 5.2, the strengthening of technological and military aspects of capitalism. Chapter 6, colonialism as a system for underdeveloping Africa. 6.1, the supposed benefits of colonialism to Africa. You see, we got a whole section here dedicated to Thomas Sowell. See, Walter Rodney was ahead of his time already. We got a whole section, not even a chapter, a section dedicated to Thomas Sowell after going all through these first 5 chapters. 6.2, negative character of the social, political, and economic consequences. 6.3, education for underdevelopment. 6.4, development by contradiction. I'm just going to look at a couple pages before I finish because I think it's been thoroughly gone through. So countries per capita income in US dollars, 1968. Canada, about 2,200, 500. US, 3,500. France, 1,700. UK, 1,500. Now look at this. Africa as a whole, 1,400. This is the per capita in US dollars in 1960 or up to the year 1968. This is old data. And we could see, obviously, 1968 is a good portion of time after neocolonialism, and we can see clearly the results. Next page, final page. So no one has been able to come up with a figure representing total losses to the African population sustained through the extraction of slave labor from all areas to all destinations over the many centuries that slave trade existed. However, on every other continent from the 15th century onwards, the population showed constant and sometimes spectacular natural increase, while it is striking that the same did not apply to Africa. I wonder why. One European scholar gave the following estimates of world population in millions according to continents. So 1650, basically every century, 1650, 17, 1850, and then 1900, so they cut it off for the final one, 50 years. Africa is at a steady stagnation until 1900, and population starts to grow. Europe has steady increase. Asia has exponential increase. So Europe never stayed at 100 million. So these are in the millions. So that means in 1650, Africa was only 100 million. Throughout 3 centuries until 1900, it became 120 million. Europe grew all the way up to 423 million. Asia grew from 250 million all the way to 850 million. So, in terms of Africa and all these other countries coming out of their little phase of oppression, of colonialization, obviously the same effects or the same methods do not apply to Africa because Africa is a unique case. It is a complex case. It is a case that ran for centuries. Name a country that has been subjugated for centuries. Name one that's gone through the same amount as Africa, as the Conference of Berlin. Name a country that has went through a Conference of Berlin when European countries sat down and decided what they were going to do with that country. Name a country with a Conference of Berlin. So, two takeaways. Two takeaways. This is how the book looks. These are the various covers. How Europe underdeveloped Africa. I really suggest that you go and find that book. Two takeaways. So when Republicans say that colonization was good, they're definitely trying to grift. They're definitely trying to indoctrinate you into conservatism. Colonization was not good. Africa was doing well as a continent, even as different countries, because they give lots of examples. Africa was doing very well before Europeans came. Africa did not need colonization to thrive. Africa did not need colonization to thrive at all. And number two, in terms of all these other places that went through colonization, imperialism, oppression, is not the same. It is not the same as what Africa went through. Blackness is, anti-blackness is global. Anti-blackness is a global business. That's how it should be looked at. There's something going on in the US. There's issues going on in Canada. There's issues going on in South America. There's issues in Australia. There's issues in Asia. There's issues in India. There's issues in Europe. There's issues everywhere with anti-blackness. So you can choose to go the Thomas Sowell route and say slavery was all the same, colonization was all the same, and it was a benefit because without enslavement and colonization, black and primitive people would not have been able to find a better way of life from what they were living because obviously being sovereign and controlling your own land is not worth it to Thomas Sowell. Controlling your own land, controlling your own resources. So, I mean, that's really it for me. I got nothing else. That's another debunk. Hopefully, you learned something. You got a resource now because I don't just speak from my opinions. I don't speak from my feelings. I speak with an educated, informed opinion that comes from literary texts. I've read several dozens of books in terms of Black history. I won't say dozens, not dozens yet, but at least a dozen for sure. I've read a wide range of books. That should be like a challenge I should make. How many books have these conservatives read other than Thomas Sowell? See, that's the problem. I don't just read one author and take it as gospel, but I don't want to get into a long rant. Thank you for listening. Let me know if there's anything else about that Thomas Sowell has said that you want me to look at, analyze, and debunk. I'm not going to say I could debunk everything Thomas Sowell has said because everything Thomas Sowell says is not false, but he definitely cherry picks the information that he wants to. And I'm demonstrating that. And you can see that in real time. So then when you get hit with the, oh, you got to listen to the Thomas Sowell, you already know the okey doke, where the okey doke is coming from and how it's being played. You can see the curveball coming from a mile away. So, with that being said, thank you for listening. Get in the comment section. Let me know what you think because this is very important in terms of education and what we put into our minds. Peace out, folks.